User Research for the Social Web, Dana Chisnell.
Thank you. This was a perfectly ordinary, very mundane usability test. We were in a rented facility in a place called Waltham, Massachusetts. You know, one of those places where market research happens usually. But we had rented it for usability test, and the setup was exactly the way you would expect it to be. My client, a bunch of observers were in one room, and I was with the participant in the other room. Computer, little pad of paper, that's pretty much it. We were on the 7th participant out of about 15. Her name was Shelley, and it had been a long day already. And what we were testing was a retirement calculator. This was a tool that was supposed to help people to plan out how much money they needed to live the way they wanted to when they were finished working and not making an income from a job anymore. Shelley was going along very nicely, had lots of nice things to say about this tool. But one of the first tasks that you do, one of the first things that you do in this thing is you look at a series of goals that the designers thought that people who were going to retire would want to do. Things like starting a small business, learning a language, going back to school. And we're going along quite happily. And Shelley, who's nowhere near retirement age, she's in her mid-30s, is kind of excited about this, saying that she likes the idea of actually thinking this through now, before she has to think about it very seriously. And so everything is good until this moment when I hear an audible sob. And I realize that she's crying. This is only the second time in my career when somebody has cried during a usability test. Tears streaming. And I say, okay, we can stop. If it's that bad, if it's that hard, we could definitely stop. She says, no. It's not that. I said, well, what's going on? And she said, well, I had picked these things for myself, and then I saw this one goal, and it just got to me. And I said, well, which one was that? And she said, well, this caring for aging parents. I said, so what's special about that? She said, my mother has a disease called ALS, and she's going to die in a few months. I am not going to get the chance to take care of my mother in her old age. So we stopped, we got a glass of water, mopped up the tears. I said, we can stop. And she said, no, I really want to keep going. This is a thing that I need to do. I should start thinking about this, and this looks like a pretty good tool. I just wish that my dad were here. And I said, well, why is that? And she said, well, I make all of my life decisions, all of my big life decisions about money and work and love. Dad helps me make all these decisions. I said, well, we could call him. And she said, no, he's at work. I don't really want to do that. So after a little break, we went back to work. But it was at that moment that I realized that this really mundane thing, a retirement calculator, was actually part of the social web. Now, there was absolutely nothing unusual about this usability test. In fact, it was a pretty standard setup. One person, one computer, a person pretending to do a task. And we've been doing it this way. We've been doing usability testing exactly like this, with a few variations, for about 30 years, maybe longer. My first one was in 1983. But this method really failed Shelley, and it failed my clients too. So I started thinking about the goodness or the oldness of usability testing and the social web when Google launched a social network called Buzz. The idea of Buzz was that if you use Gmail, that it automatically and instantly connected you to all the people you corresponded with frequently and connected them to one another. On its surface, this was a spectacularly wonderful idea. But, and there's a big but, it turns out that doing this actually was not such a good thing for some of their users. In fact, a woman named Harriet blogged about this the very next day after Google launched Buzz. And her story was about how now her 10-year-old son was connected online with her ex-husband, who, by a judge's order, was not allowed to be in touch with her son. So now, something that seems kind of an innocent set of connections is actually scary and dangerous for some people. She, Harriet, was very upset about this, as you might understand. It turns out that the United States government was upset about this too, because they investigated and found that Google actually violated its own privacy policies by implementing Buzz this way. And they fined Google $20 million and subjected them to 20 years of security and privacy audits to determine whether Google was actually respecting its own privacy policies. Now, Google's not the only one who's under this kind of order. Facebook is as well, and Twitter. When this came out, I blogged about it. And it seemed to me that if Google had actually done usability testing, and they have a very large user research group, big UX group, if they had done usability testing on this tool, on this social network, that they would have uncovered connections like this and other connections that people didn't necessarily want. And I actually didn't think that anybody read my blog besides me, but it turns out that a couple of people do, and one of them was a woman who sent me an anonymous email who said, we did actually do testing. We did testing in the lab with a limited prototype with fake data. So people who were coming in were using kind of random connections. It wasn't their Gmail account. It wasn't their connections. It wasn't the people they corresponded with. So doing testing this way, and we all do this a lot, I've been doing it for years, just really is not telling us what we need to know about designing for the social web. The techniques that we're using, they can really only tell us about things that we are looking for. And the primary thing that usability testing is looking for is frustration. Is the user stuck? Is the user frustrated? Are there obstacles to them completing a thing that they want to do? We are really, really not sure how to do user research and how to do usability testing that will tell us about the relationships that are involved online. Something's not working, and I think it's this. Real people just don't sit down in front of a computer and ask them. They don't behave the way that we ask them to in a usability test. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody. A couple of years ago, I did some testing for a company called WebEx. This is the company that offers a service where you can have online meetings. And they were doing a redesign of the user interface. We had a prototype. It was limited. And we invited people to come set up meetings and close meetings individually. Did we actually hold meetings? No. This seems insane now that I think of it, and I designed that experiment. I did some usability testing for a company called Marriott on their website, Marriott.com. They're an international hotelier. And we were looking at the experience from the time somebody gets to the site to the time they actually press submit on their credit card number and book a hotel room. But we didn't take into account the other people who help make the decisions about which is the hotel. You know, if you're on a leisure trip and you have kids, there are kids involved. They want a pool at the hotel. They want to be close to playgrounds and places for kids. If it's a business trip, your priorities are completely different. We didn't take those things into account. We didn't take those people into account in this usability test. And if you just come back to the retirement tool, this wasn't problematic only for Shelley. It turns out that for most of the guys who were in this study, they wished that their wives were present with them because they didn't actually know what the household expenses were. And the women in the study wished that their kids were available because they wanted to talk to them about future healthcare decisions and long-term care. So we left a lot of people out. The thing is, most of us who've been working in user research and usability testing in what's now called user experience design, but wasn't when I started doing this, we are trained to think about human-computer interaction. One person, one computer, and what happens there. But more and more, what we are looking at when we're designing is human-to-human interaction, mediated by technology. And this technology may be really invisible to the users. I think of cell phones, for example. Practically everyone has a cell phone now. But you don't think of this as a computer. I got to do another study about retirement where I interviewed a whole bunch of really lovely people who were in their 60s and 70s and 80s. And one of them was a woman named Paula, and she described herself as computer illiterate. But she had an iPad, which she sent email on, and she connected to her grandchildren on Facebook through. She read books, she read the news. It wasn't a static thing for her, and it's certainly, she didn't think of it as a computer. But there's a chip in there, a pretty powerful one. So these methods that we've been using probably were always less than perfect. But mostly, I think they were probably enough in the beginning. When I started doing this, like I said, my first usability test was in 1983, only about 10,000 people were going to be using the thing that I was testing. And that was huge. That was a huge audience. And that was really about automating manual processes for the first time. I got to usability test the first calendaring app. But it's not like that anymore. Scale is huge. Billions of people use Facebook and Google and Amazon. And usability testing is not built for that. And computers are everywhere. They're in everything. So considering The social aspect of this, the social aspect of technology use, really magnifies the imperfections. So you'd think that since there are computers and everything, since technology is practically ambient, that everything about what we do has changed. But it hasn't, actually. Technology gives us cycles, and we're at a point in one of the cycles when a lot of new conventions are being revealed. If you look at designing for mobile, for example, we're making a lot of decisions kind of on the fly about how people interact with what we are making. This is really exciting, but it's also kind of baffling sometimes. There's a lot of discussion about, is flat design good? What is an affordance anymore? This makes it difficult to design all of those things, emerging conventions, emerging standards, sort of de facto design templates. And so I think testing is more important than ever at every level, no matter what development methodology that you're using. And I've come down to to 5 factors in user research that I'm pretty convinced that we should seriously rethink. And I think we're going to end up with a better world and better designs because of it. First, I'm going to, usually when I say this, it feels like something radical, but I'm going to say that everything that happens online is actually social, and it always has been. You don't have to be on a social network or be using social media. You just have to be online. And by social, what I mean is anything one person does to change the behavior of another person. This is social. In a smaller group, I often will ask the audience, name me one thing that you can do online that's not social. One time, one guy says, watching pornography. Like, I think you're changing somebody's behavior there. So just being online is a social act. Next, as I mentioned, scale is size matters. When you go from talking about one person and one computer, or possibly a group of, a few thousand people using your design, to millions and perhaps billions of people using your design, you have some really interesting sampling problems when you do user research and usability testing. Large sample sizes don't necessarily tell you what you need to know. For example, when I dug into the Google Buzz story a bit further, and there was a lot of press about this at the time, Google had been testing internally with 20,000 people for about a year. You'd think that 20,000 people would be a pretty good sample size for a usability test. But this is a group of people who have really bought in to the idea of Buzz because they're inside this protected garden, inside this protected network. While they were testing, it didn't connect them to anybody outside Google. Everybody they talked to was inside. So you have to be careful about what your sample is, even if it's big, because clearly this didn't expose the kinds of problems that happened instantly on public release. They have to be the right samples. But let's look at scale another way. More and more what we are creating online are massively user-generated information architectures. One of my favorite examples is a website called Quora.com. Quora is a website where anybody in the network can ask questions of anybody else, and you can answer questions from anybody else in the network. It's really interesting, and some of the questions are really simple and mundane, and like, how do you hire an accountant? And some of them are really profound, like, what is the importance of religion? And so it's fascinating. It can be quite time-consuming. But nobody at Quora actually generated any of those questions. All of the questions and all of the answers were generated by users. So what I want to know is, how do you design for that? How do you test for that? How do you do the research that will tell you how people are actually going to behave in that context, in that little world? Third, tasks. Tasks are the centerpiece of doing usability tests. We all try to create task scenarios that are realistic and not just exercising the mechanics of the tool that we're testing. But it turns out that people don't actually do tasks. What they do is they sit down with something in mind, an outcome that they want to have. And their task actually changes without their even being conscious of it, while they're working their way through it, depending on what just happened and what they think might happen next. It's sort of an extended activity that's really not well defined in the mind of the user. And think about this when you're trying to do something online. They're probably just tasks, they're probably just activities, right, where goals emerge and change. And all of this depends on context and timing and space and whether you're being interrupted or focused. One of the other centerpieces of doing usability testing especially is the International Standards Organization Standard for Usability. Efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. So what I want to know is, when we're talking about having Twitter or Facebook open all day long at an event like this, what's efficient about that? How do you measure that? What's important and how does that fit into the user's mental model? I think that if you have Facebook open all day, or even a retirement tool that you're working with, the retirement tool that's supposed to be helping a conversation happen within a family. What's the task? What is the discrete scenario there? One of the ISO measures is satisfaction. But I think this is probably the wrong measure. In fact, it's a really low bar. Satisfaction is actually quite a problem. Once you eliminate the frustration, you have a usable thing. People can be satisfied with it. But what do you do after that? How do you measure what happens after that? We should probably be looking at user control. Does the person who's doing this feel like they're moving forward in what they're trying to do and trying to reach the outcome that they're looking for? And I think we should be looking at engagement. Now, engagement is like the new conversion, and a lot of people are talking about it. But I think it's a bigger thing than just getting people to come back to your website or getting people to use your app more. People want to be the boss of their data. And to not be the boss of their data is very unsatisfying. It's beyond frustrating. And all you have to do is look at Facebook and its new privacy policies and how they're changing settings automatically, taking some settings away. And then we have a conversation about that. So we need to take a hard look at the conventional metrics of efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction and think about, what does engagement really mean? This is a thing that you're not going to find through analytics. You know, time on the site is not going to tell you whether people love your site. It's just not. It's about inherent value, and I think we're not good at understanding any of that, what people really value, what they really trust, and what brings them back. And what marketing thinks are the benefits of an app or a tool or a website often doesn't match what real people think. So we should be asking, what keeps bringing customers back? What keeps bringing users back? And relying on this thing that you've designed. What would happen if you took it away? Would they miss it? I think this is a much bigger thing than measuring satisfaction. And by the way, I'm pretty sure that time is not a measure. How much time I leave tabs open on my browser all the time. This probably is not going to tell you much. We don't always know what the real task is, so task completion, what does that mean? What are the success criteria? So here we are at 5. While users want control of their information, they're also, for lack of a better word, hacking your user interface constantly. They're messing with it. They're creating workarounds because it doesn't necessarily do what they want it to do exactly the way they want to do it. And when I was learning how to do usability testing, workarounds, they were a problem. This was the thing that you needed to watch to redesign. But with apps and websites being used at such huge scale, how do you fix that? How do you fix those kind of workarounds? You don't, actually, especially if you look at an example like Twitter, where users introduced many of the features, many of the standard things that we use all the time. Hashtags, this was not part of the original set. Retweets, things like that. So, individual workarounds, things that people want to do, they just surface. They bubble up in the network, and then people start using them. And that means that the etiquette and the social norms also adjust over time and through scale. So your design, much as you might not like it, is effectively crowdsourced to your users. So this idea of being online, onlineness, I like to call it, and AMIA technology, is really about context and who is talking to whom, what the relationships are about, why are they existing. And the important thing here is that we really must not violate the context of those relationships. To go back to Harriet and her son and her ex, nobody anticipated that happening, and maybe we should have. There are lots of other examples like this. Lou showed a website called Etsy. Etsy is a shopping site where people can sell crafts that they made, and there are a lot of beautiful things there. But at one point, Etsy, the company, decided that it was going to open up its network so that anybody could see who was buying what. And the idea was that people who were buying similar things might circle together. They might create little communities. But what it really meant was that your boss could actually do a search about you, and up would come all of the purchases that you've ever made on Etsy, which might be lingerie or other intimate things. And Etsy did this without the user's permission. One famous story is Facebook at one time had a product called Beacon. And what Beacon did was it tracked things that you purchased and broadcast this out to your friends, to your followers. And this worked really well. It was very interesting. The advertising companies loved it. But one day, a guy came back with his purchase, and it was broadcast on Facebook. And his girlfriend saw this. And the reason that this is a problem that his girlfriend saw this purchase is that he had bought an engagement ring at Walmart. He never got to use the ring. So there are all these unintentional consequences that testing and research might help us with if we knew how to do them better. So lab testing and structured field visits, mini ethnographies, they come up lacking when we try to understand how designs fit into people's real lives. Because the lab, that little mini ethnography, this is not like real life. It's very hard to stage that. It's very hard to see how these things fit into real relationships. So something that's built for human-computer interaction, one person, one computer, one task, it just doesn't cover somebody interacting online with a whole bunch of people who may or may not be friends, who may be close friends, who may be close family, or they might be total strangers. And so I think the next step for all of us is to start thinking about things beyond what we've learned in school, in design school or computer science or psychology, that we need to look at some other disciplines that have sort of ventured into this space already. We call them polymaths, or Renaissance people, generalists, people who look at lots of different fields from behavioral economics to sociolinguistics, and to see what we can learn there. But not only to see what we can learn there, but to basically rip off methods and techniques for research, and to learn what they think they know already about how people behave in relationships online. So, to get to what we should be doing instead of the kind of standard usability testing, I interviewed a whole bunch of smart people who've been working in social design, in social media, and social networks for a while to see what they had done. And we had a great time over beers talking about their failures, how they had designed experiments that they just couldn't learn what they wanted to learn because they couldn't break into the relationships and the context. And so I'm going to share those things with you. So one of the first things that you can do is have people just sit with you and tell you about their profiles. Why did they set up their profile in the social network or on your system the way they did it? Why are they connected to the people they're connected to? Are they all sort of in the same group, or are they different groups? Do the groups talk to one another? What's the rationale for setting up the profile the way they did? Another really interesting technique, which also works at parties at conferences, by the way, is to ask people how they met. The people who are in their follower list, or who are their friends, or who they're connected with. Did they actually meet them? I know people who, their rules for Facebook, for example, are only close friends and family. Other people I know who have rules about Facebook talk about how they only friend somebody on Facebook if they've ever had dinner with them or had a meal with them. So they've met face to face. But plenty of other people will take friends who they've never seen before. They might not ever have conversed before. Just take random friends to maybe bump up their numbers. And all of those stories are really interesting to learning mental models about how social contexts work. A method borrowed from game testing is to create multi-user sessions. So you invite one person, for example, who's an appropriate participant, and ask them to invite their friends into the room. They're all in the room at the same time. Now, certainly there are parts of this that are not realistic, but at least you get to see what the interaction is like. And you can set this up in a number of ways. So you could have 2 rounds with your person, your main person. Ask them to invite people who they're really close to, who they spend a lot of time communicating with or socializing with. And maybe have a second round of, kind of acquaintances or business ties who they're not personally connected with. One thing a friend of mine tried was a video diary study. It was sort of like reality TV for usability and user research. She gave everybody little video cameras. This was before everybody had smartphones, before a lot of people had smartphones. But she gave them little video cameras and asked them to, whenever they were online or whenever they were communicating with particular people, that they just hit the red button and record the conversation, record the interaction, or talk into the camera about what the experience was like. Now, this generated loads of fabulous data, and actually seeing the people and hearing the people talk for themselves in an organic setting, where they were normally doing this, was really interesting and really useful. One thing that I've wanted to try forever is something called experience sampling. This is a method that was actually invented by a guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and you might know him from a book called Flow. He used pagers then because that was the technology of the day, but he gave all of his participants pagers, and then a few times a day would send them a page and ask them to call him back and answer questions about what they were doing and who they were with and how they were feeling about it. And this would be so easy to do now with SMS, just sending text messages. I could send you all a text message right now and say, what do you think of my session? I'm not sure I want to know. But I think that you could learn a lot about whether people are using your design, your app, your website, and where that happens, and who people are with, and who they're communicating with at the time. Now, the downside of all of this, especially if you're talking about shorter release cycles, is that doing this kind of research takes a lot more time than just whipping together a usability test in a lab. But I think that we have to start thinking about doing some of this at least. There's certainly a place for usability testing, and I don't want to give anybody the impression that we should stop doing it. I think most of us should be doing more of it. But these more in-depth methods are going to tell us a lot that will help us do better usability tests. Because real interaction unfolds over time and in a much wider context than in the little bubble that we see in a usability test. So doing research for social design is going to ask a lot more of you and of your participants. And because the investment is greater, the risks of getting valid data and reliable information are different. So you have to be really careful about how you design your experiment. And while I'm a fan of just putting stuff out there and seeing what happens, I think we're going to have to be a lot more careful. That's not going to work forever. We're going to get into trouble again as we see more situations like Buzz and like Facebook's Beacon come up. I don't know why we keep repeating the same mistake from company to company, but we do. But someday, management is going to look at Facebook and Twitter and Google being under investigation and having to be audited and how much that costs. And they're going to go, we really don't want to do that. So is there something we can do up front to avoid that? We'll have to be really clear and very, very sure about the questions that we're asking. Are they the right questions? And when we learn the answers, what can we reasonably do? What can we ethically do with what we find out? Because we're going to learn some really intimate stuff about people and how they talk to one another and who they talk to and what they talk about. One thing I'm pretty convinced of is that we are going to have to do a much better job of understanding, why are we all here together in this room? Why is this a cohesive group? Why are we sharing information with one another? Why do we collaborate? What do human beings get out of that? Are we just biologically programmed for this? Or is there something else going on? And if we are biologically programmed for this, how does that work in design? How does that help us know what to do, how to design, how to do research, how to test? And so I want to bring you back to the Usability Lab in Waltham, Massachusetts, with Shelley. She's mopping up the tears. My team, my client and I, we asked a business question, which was basically about money. And I can't help wondering, maybe the business might have been better served if we'd asked more personal stuff about Shelley, about where she is in life, who she tells important things to, who she goes to when she doesn't know the answer to a question, or when she needs to make an important decision. What is the right question in this situation? If we had started out with asking her maybe, who do you go to when you don't know the answer, we might have learned some really useful things that would have expanded the audience for the tool, and we would have learned things about Shelley and her network that would have extended the customer relationship. We would have been able to create a tool that does a lot better at supporting real life. And so with our methods, these generation-old methods, at least generation-old, we really only know how to find the things that we're looking for. We are constrained, I will say that, we are constrained by the market pressure to get stuff out. But we also get our butts kicked when something doesn't go right. So there's some big trade-offs there, and I think it's because I think some of that comes from using these old tools. We need some new power tools. Right now, we don't have very good ways of learning about things that we don't know about. Or maybe you do. I hope you'll tell me. I think it's time to rework, and to remaster the standard methods that we've been using. So, be brave. Design the experiment. Experiment with design. And get out from behind your computer. Thank you.